Okay, now let's move to analyzing the internal risk, because external risk may or may not be in your control, or you may or may not always be able to assess it. And then, of course, you have to manage it, the internal risk. So the background looks different because I turned away from the window. The sun is setting, the light is coming from here, the artificial light in the room. So if I face the window, then the light is from the back. Did you need to know that? Not really, but I just decided to tell you in case you get surprised by the background. Capacity development projects or programs for resilience should typically span over several years, even if reality often is different. Irrespective of how well planned such initiatives are, there might be various factors that have the potential to limit their effectiveness. These factors can be external to the project or program and difficult or impossible for the partners to reduce. For example, political instability or global financial crisis. So one of your supply chains might get perturbed because you're relying on, let's say, coconuts from the Philippines, and Philippines just got hit with a typhoon and so on. However, they can also be internal and possible to reduce through systematic risk analysis and management. For example, high staff turnover or low local commitment to capacity development. This eighth step of the logical framework approach is thus crucial for the viability of any project or program and must be taken seriously. Needless to say, there are many ways to analyze and manage internal risk in capacity development projects or programs. However, a straightforward way that I recommend is based on the same scenario-based approach to risk analysis presented earlier, with only minor changes in phrasing to better suit this particular context. In short, analyzing risk in projects and programs is the practice of answering three questions. What can happen that can have a negative impact on the project that is set up to build capacity for resilience? How likely is that to happen? So you have to have some sense of the probability of occurrence of this particular risk that has a potential negative impact. If it happens, what are the consequences for the project? How dire is it going to be? Is it going to be debilitating, irreversible, and so on and so forth? So there are again many methodologies to use to answer answer these three questions, but one way of doing it is to use brainstorming techniques in the project team to identify relevant risk scenarios for the project or program, estimating how likely these risk scenarios are, as well as what consequences they would involve. So you have always irreducible risks after you've done all the risk analysis and prepared to manage them. So you have to have some acceptable irreducible risks as well. Answering the three questions would then have generated a list of risk scenarios that are clearly described and with assigned likelihoods and consequences. For each risk scenario that is not considered tolerable, the project team must design specific risk reduction measures to reduce the likelihood of the scenario. So it's a prevention step. Reduce the potential consequence beforehand, so that's the mitigation of the risk, and or developing effective response and recovery if the scenario does happen, which is the preparedness step. So you have prevention, mitigation, and preparedness. Risk alleviation is what is also used as a terminology for risk mitigation. If a project risk is substantial and nothing can be done to reduce the risk, it becomes a project assumption and is transferred to the last step of the logical framework approach, which we look at next. So in the meantime, the main aspects of internal risk analysis and management are summarized in box 9.9, which are about answering questions. So the summary of internal risk analysis and management. The internal risk analysis and management can be summarized as the answer to four questions. What can happen that can have negative impact on the project, which we already looked at? How likely is that to happen, which we already considered? If that happens, what are the consequences for the project? We listed. Fourth one, what can be done to reduce the likelihood of it happening and or its consequences? So prevention and mitigation. So how would you reduce the impact or alleviate the risk itself? Okay, so let's move on to analysis of assumptions. This is the last step. Regardless of how well the project risks are analyzed and managed, there are always factors that might negatively affect the project or program, which the project team can do nothing about. I would refer to them as irreducible risks. These factors are called project assumptions and must be also analyzed, since the viability of the entire capacity development initiative depends on them. You can think of these as, earthquakes and volcanoes, which you cannot plan for or predict, but you must be able to have this risk somehow built into the system so that somebody is responsible for this. So if the risks from storms and droughts and floods and heat waves are left, let's say, to the private sector, then the government can own up the irreducible risks of damage from earthquakes and volcanoes. Okay, as an example. Such analysis of assumptions constitutes the last step of the logical framework approach and is often confused with the internal risk analysis and management presented above. This confusion is mirrored in literature, where one explanation states that an assumption is a positive statement of a condition required for the project objectives to be achieved, while a risk is a negative statement of condition that might prevent the project's objectives from being achieved. I do not think such distinction is helpful at all, since it is completely contingent on phrasing and nothing else. A more useful differentiation is to view assumptions as significant risks that cannot be sufficiently reduced, but which threaten the viability of the entire project or program. So although the assumptions should already have been identified in the internal risk analysis and management, this last step is not in any way irrelevant. You cannot just wish them away. Quite the contrary, since the analysis of assumptions highlights key requisites for the project or program that assists both the overall assessment of the viability of the initiative and present the only legitimate reasons for failures. So you had unavoidable risk, irreducible risk, which became your assumptions, and then project fails, then you have legitimate reasons for failure. In other words, if the assumptions are deemed feasible by all actors and still turn out not to hold, the project team cannot be blamed. There is, in other words, an important political difference between risks which the project team can manage and assumptions which have to be left to act of God in some ways. Okay, so summary of analysis of assumptions. The analysis of assumptions can be summarized as the answer to questions: what are the central assumptions that may influence the results, purposes, and goal of the project? Okay, so without examples, again, this is not so obvious, but read the book, listen to the podcast again if necessary, and try to get a sense of what we mean. Internal risk analysis and management, so prevention, mitigation, and recovery or preparedness are easy enough to understand, but assumptions and irreducible risks, I gave the example of earthquake and volcanoes, so if that helps, that's good. Otherwise, you know that there are many assumptions that are made and left as part of the project and may lead to failure as well. Okay, so let's leave it here and come back and look at deconditioning capacity development for resilience. We'll see what we mean by that in the next podcast. Okay, see you next time.